Yeah, I think we're going to start. Good morning, everyone. We think we're going to be starting in about 5 minutes because the session upstairs got delayed and they're just walking down.
To the other side of the room so we're evened out, yeah. For those that you just came in, Harpreet has announced that we'll start at 11:05, just to let the people from the other sessions make their way into the room. Thank you for your patience. Welcome, everyone. There's also some seats here in the front, on the left, on this side of the room, and some gaps here. I have a preference for conference room 4 because it's very beautifully lit. But this is actually more intimate. We're closer together. I don't know if you noticed, conference room 3 is very far apart from each other. The other conference rooms, indeed, they're made for diplomats in I guess, heated negotiations. They don't want to be too close, right? But this is the appropriate room for our discussion today.
I think just one more minute because people are still walking in. All right, good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a really enriching discussions over the last 2 days, and we are here on the final day of the forum, and we couldn't have not discussed the issues around mandatory human rights due diligence. In fact, we heard many a times during the conversations over the last 3 days that voluntary measures are just not enough and much more is needed. Is mandatory human rights due diligence an answer to that? I think we will find out just now. The session, Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence in Asia, Principles and Practices in Action, will help us understand the urgency and the basis for which MHREDD, it just takes it so longer to even pronounce the acronym, is being pursued, and the consequences or the trade-offs for inaction or delayed action, and clarify the concerns from Asia's perspectives and its readiness. And to lead the session today, we have our very own Sean Lees, the Business and Human Rights Specialist from UNDP Asia Pacific, who would be the moderator for the session. And Sean, with this, I hand it over to you to also introduce your panelists.
Thank you very much, Harpreet. And thank you for being gathered here today. Indeed, there's already been several conversations on human rights due diligence inside sessions, and I'm glad to see some of those people in this room again here today. I do think it's perhaps one of the top 3 most important conversations that we can have. So with that, I'm very grateful to our panelists assembled here today who are leading on this conversation in Asia about human rights, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. Forgive me for a moment as I proceed to introduce each. Lena Ghosh, Head of Human Rights and Social Standards from RSPO, Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil from Malaysia. I'm also joined by Sarini Achavanantakul, Managing Director from South Forest, Thailand. Sarah Monti, Senior Responsible Business Hub Coordinator from the European Chambers of Commerce in Cambodia. Hideyaku or Roy Umetsu, an attorney with Mori, Hamada, and Matsumoto in Tokyo, Japan, one of the largest law firms in Japan. Vyasna Non, he is a trade union specialist and advisor based out of Cambodia. Also, can I just have this, the next slide, please? Rather, put the slide deck up just for a second, please. Many people have asked, because I made an announcement in our climate change session yesterday, to have more information about this October 4-5 event. Corporate Sustainability and Environmental Rights in Asia, which is will be run in partnership with the government of Sweden, European Union, and our colleagues at UN Environment Program, is going to focus on business, and it's going to focus on the environmental rights agenda. Please mark your calendars. It will happen in the two rooms, conference room 3 and 4. Everyone is warmly welcome. That QR code will link you to the save the date. Registration is coming soon. Thanks for posting that slide. You can take it down now. Thank you very much. Well, as many of you know, on June 1st, just a week ago, the European Union achieved another milestone on its journey on the road to mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. Members of the European Parliament voted to adopt the language of the current draft of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. I will refer to this as CSDDD on occasion, okay? This draft follows other mandatory measures in Europe, though. There's the German Supply Chain Act, there's the French Duty of Vigilance Law, and the Norwegian Transparency Act. CSDDD is not the only due diligence measure coming out of Europe, and we'll discuss more of that in time. But at its core, the CSDDD seeks to apply the due diligence formula that's outlined by the UN Guiding Principles on business in human rights. And so CSDDD will require business-based or operating in the European Union to adopt due diligence policies, identify human rights and environmental risks, implement mitigating measures to address those risks, track and evaluate the performance or the effectiveness of the actions that are taken to address those risks, to report publicly on their due diligence efforts, for companies to report publicly on their due diligence efforts, and also require companies to adopt grievance mechanisms and provide remedies where they identify adverse human rights and environmental rights impacts as they conduct due diligence. These are the basic outlines, these are the basic elements of what the CSDDD and what the UN Guiding Principles provide for. Now, I'm not going to deep dive into CSDDD because this is not a session necessarily on CSDDD itself. There are other, as I said, mandatory human rights due diligence measures that are coming from different sources. But it is true, though, that the CSDDD is the subject on everyone's mind right now, and that the move towards these laws are being widely celebrated by human rights activists in the global north and global south. The cheers are so loud because the CSDDD will apply directly or indirectly to nearly every significant enterprise in the world. And by I mean significant, by the largest enterprises around the world. And therefore, they will touch supply chain partners, business partners, wherever those partners exist. As I said, I won't be detailing CSDDD, but it is important to understand the full scope of its potential impact. Today, as Harpreet mentioned, we're going to focus on the views from Asia about this legislative movement, among others. And we're going to talk about the readiness of Asia to adopt mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, whether that is at the instigation of another region or as a homegrown initiative. Now, as you might expect, CSDDD is not without its controversies. Some have claimed very vigorously that the directive is too broad and will place an undue burden, especially on small and medium-sized enterprises or smallholder farmers in the global south. As you're well aware, SMEs often lack the resources and capacities to undertake these compliance efforts, and they may not be so easily tracked down and forced into doing it in the first place. The directive also does not take into account the different realities of companies operating in different parts of the world. There are steep cultural differences that may complicate due diligence processes, differences that involve personal relationships. In Asia and other places, personal relationships arguably are as important as the rule of law in ensuring integrity in business-to-business transactions. And CSDDD doesn't necessarily, and other mandatory human rights measures, due diligence measures may not take that into account. The directive could also lead to trade protectionism and make it more difficult for companies from the Global South to export their goods and services to the EU. CSDDD and other due diligence measures could lead to a loss of jobs in the Global South. It could lead to a loss of jobs in developing Asia. But the last word goes to human rights activists who claim, some of which claim, this CSDDD does not go far enough. They claim the directive is not ambitious enough, frankly, to really go to address the root causes of human rights abuses and environmental degradation in our region. Now, to be fair, we will be, as I said, focusing a bit more, weighted much more towards CSDDD than other mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence measures taking place around the world. But as I say that, I want to be fair to the EU, the European Commission, and others. They have put an enormous amount of resources in studying the potential impact of this measure, both on their own economy and the economies to which they do business. They have hosted wide-ranging consultations, and if any of you have read that first publication on their first proposed directive, the first proposal, you'll get a very good indication of just how much time and effort went into surveying companies and other stakeholders around the world. A last word. As I said, CSDDD is not the only game in town. There are other measures pressuring companies to take up due diligence practices with implications for companies in Asia. The U.S. forced labor import legislation, in which there are two, also encourage or pressure companies to consider due diligence. Very recently, the U.S. issued export control licensing guidelines from the Department of Commerce that will require companies to conduct due diligence. There's also Japan's guidance to its companies on the same topic. So it's not just a European affair, but indeed because of the launch, because of the implications, the size and scope of the European market, there will be a lot of discussion on this CSDDD. A few more words, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. Human rights and environmental due diligence has become so momentous, in part because it's implicating a wider international conversation about the costs and risks of globalization. And it's getting involved and it's getting complicated by a conversation about the need to, perceived or otherwise, to de-risk supply chains, global supply chains. In this region itself, mandatory human rights due diligence is intensifying tensions between human rights and environmental activists and proponents for economic development. It's also, in some conversations, it's also implicating the conversation about cultural relativism and asking us to view human rights, mandatory human rights due diligence through the lens of history, a history between East and West and between global North and global South, a history that sometimes involves uncomfortable topic headings, uncomfortable conversations, shall we say. I'm not certain that we will answer all of these issues. Whether something as benign sounding as due diligence will reshape production around the world or reshape relationships between regions or indeed between people. But our panelists today are going to take us on a journey. We're going to start that journey and end that journey, I think, in Cambodia, in Southeast Asia, certainly. So let's get this conversation started, shall we? Turning my attention to Sarah, working at EuroCham. How is the news? How's the news about the current draft of CSDDD being received in Cambodia? Does the draft meet or exceed expectations of the business community there? Is it a matter of concern for the members of your chambers? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for the questions, and good morning, everyone. I would say that working in Cambodia, in a production country and dealing with both brands and factories, especially in the garment sector, which is one of the key drivers of Cambodian economy. I would say that the draft of the directive goes beyond the expectations. Let's say all the new regulatory framework that we have today goes beyond the expectations. So the business community, at least the European business community, I can say, is excited and scared at the same time. I now give you maybe some numbers at a glance about Cambodia. The total export of the country is dominated by the apparel and textile goods, which represent the 70% of the total exports of Cambodia. In 2021, Cambodia was in the top 10 of global exporter for textile and apparel goods, before Myanmar, before Sri Lanka, and before Pakistan. The main market destination remains US, while at the end of 2021, we assisted to a drop in orders and a decline of numbers, let's say, especially towards the European market, which now represents around 24% of the total exports of Cambodia in the textile sector. So these numbers are just to give you a general idea of the picture that we face now in the country, and to say that the textile industry especially is facing a delicate moment, let's say, because of this decrease in terms of trade volumes. And for sure, there are a lot of concerns towards these new mandatory standards in terms of sustainability and in terms of transparency and mapping of the supply chains. So we receive lots of requests in terms of updates and clarifications. So our members in Eurocham want to know what's happening at global level and what kind of implications their businesses will face in the future. So that's why, thanks to the great initiative of the German Agency for International Development, Eurocham now is developing and is hosting a responsible business hub. And this hub wants to be a supporting desk for the private sector. We want to help brands and factories, specifically, I mean, local factories, to be prepared in advance and to adapt to the new regulatory standards, I mean, in terms of sustainability. And, I mean, our project mainly now is focused on delivering advisory services, I mean, for whoever wants to approach on these topics. We provide training programs specifically addressed to different level of, let's say, participants. So we provide the trainings for brands and top management teams, and also for middle line managers and workers. And for sure, we have a knowledge platform on our website where we, let's say, make available and upload all the contents related to the latest updates and legislations at global level. Our primary focus now is on the German Supply Chain Act, effective from January of this year. And of course, I mean, focus on the European Directive on Corporate Sustainability. And so the main mission for the Responsible Business Hub in Cambodia is to share information as much as possible. We want to disseminate data, information, and strategies model, for example, to be implemented inside the factories. We want to help the brands to better map their supply chain in Cambodia. So we want to avoid the risk of, for example, unintended consequences like divestment or disengagement from the brands.
Well,
So,
let me
sorry.
ask you on that
Yeah.
note, just how likely is divestment from Cambodia? Is that maybe a driving force for Cambodian businesses to adopt human rights due diligence, or is there more of a this is just another compliance measure, we'll get used to it, or is there a very real risk of companies divesting from Cambodia?
In my opinion, we could face this risk because we need to consider Cambodia as, let's say, as a market that is smaller than others in the region. So we don't have the same numbers of Vietnam, for example, or Bangladesh in terms of numbers of factories, in terms of numbers of employees. So for sure, so we need to consider also this risk.
There's a lot of talk about shifting supply chains or de-risking your supply chain. I might have thought that Cambodia was a recipient or beneficiary of this movement of shifting out of certain countries and into others. But you actually said that there's a dip in the amount of orders that are going to the EU, other markets. Do I hear you correctly?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
I mean, so now the train volume towards Europe, I mean, declined in the last 2 years. The main cause at the end of 2021 was the exit of UK from the European bloc. And from that moment, I mean, the export towards the European market started to decline.
Thanks a lot. Sarah, another question I have is, one of the aim of things like CSDDD is not to make it harder to do business in Cambodia. It's actually to come out with positive human rights, positive sustainability, sustainable development results. How do you see it personally, perhaps? But also, what does the business community and or your stakeholders say about reaching those ultimate objectives? Is that an outcome you see coming out of the CSDDD?
Yes, I mean, so I would be optimistic for that. And I see in the future, I mean, sustainable outcomes for Cambodia. And we see and so we assist, I mean, to a positive approach from, for example, the private sector, part of the network of the European Chamber of Commerce. So I receive lots of requests from brands that want to start proactively to implement new strategies inside their supply chains and ask us, I mean, to intervene and try to find, I mean, the best options to make, let's say, the risk assessments and monitoring activities more efficient. So producers will have a more active role in the exercise of the due diligence process. And there's this shift from audits to due diligence exercise. And so what we want to make factories understand is that due diligence is not a snapshot, is not an audit or tick in the box. Due diligence is an ongoing exercise, is an ongoing process. So that's why all stakeholders, I mean, at all levels in the supply chain should be involved and engaged. So we, of course, face lots of challenges, and I would be curious maybe later to talk also with the other panelists that conducted, I mean, similar studies about the readiness, I mean, of the factories in the country for implementing these new standards in terms of sustainability due diligence. And I can say that one of the biggest challenge for us is the so-called audit fatigue. So this feeling of frustration from companies to see that new regulations, new compliance requirements and obligations in terms of monitoring and reporting are coming up. And they feel like a duplication of efforts. So our role as supporting desk is also to make them understand how to fill the gap between what they already have and what they have to achieve according to the new regulations. So another challenge is the cost of sustainability. But yeah, please.
Yep, I want to explore that subject, and perhaps even in the question and answer period as well. Some of the key messages, among several, a shift from audits to human rights due diligence and proactive measures being taken. If I may, Sarah, thank you for those comments. Let me shift to Sarini in Thailand. You recently developed a very thorough and a very detailed report on Thailand's, the readiness of Thai companies to adopt human rights due diligence. I'd like you to give us at least 3 takeaways from that report. What's the most important findings that you've made?
Thank you, Khun, and so thank you for having me here, and good morning, everyone. 3 key takeaways, that's pretty difficult. We had quite a few takeaways, but just I guess briefly mention that, so we did this through a series of surveys that we asked the Stock Exchange of Thailand as well as the SME Federation to help because we wanted to reach both the big companies and the smaller companies. We also conducted total about 10 in-depth interviews with both the big companies and the smaller companies in order to choose case studies to use for the report. That, again, the focus here is not just to focus on the big ones. We also interviewed quite a few NGOs and human rights defenders, prominent human rights defenders in Thailand to give a more complete picture. So I would say the first takeaway would be that we noticed that there's quite a different outlook and also sets of challenges that face different types of companies. So in our report, we think that is useful to classify companies into 3 different categories. So based on the commonalities of challenges. So the first would be the large companies. So for them, I think human rights nowadays in Thailand is a pretty well-known concept, and there's a lot of awareness, especially because, for example, last year, 2022 was the first year that if you were a listed company in Thailand, you had to disclose your annual filings under the new disclosure requirements called the One Report, 56.1, and that has a very big and very detailed chapter on human rights. So I think that it automatically means that at least all the listed companies, they are more aware, right? It's not a mandatory human rights due diligence requirement, but it's a mandatory disclosure requirement. So for big companies, they are very aware, they're very keen about what this is, but of course, there remains a lot of challenges. So large companies that we interviewed, essentially the ones that have conducted very detailed human rights due diligence and put all the building blocks in place, they have grievance mechanisms, have actually tried to improve their meaningful engagement, for example. Essentially, they say that that's because in the past they have faced criticisms directly about the human rights situation in their supply chain, and that kind of prompted them to really act on that. But for the other large companies, for them the challenge is, what does it mean by human rights due diligence? How much is enough? So they have a lot of, I think, still uncertainty about, how frequent it should be. Should we design, set up a whole new team to do this? In terms of the supply chain, there's a lot of concern about how to get the suppliers up to speed and comply with the policies, because UNGP places a lot of emphasis on the supply chain responsibility. So I think overall, I would say the large companies are, this is where they are at, essentially. And so they say that it would greatly help if there's more clarity on, exactly a kind of more operational level policy and guidelines, as well as the how to assist their suppliers, to better comply. For the second set of companies, I would say we classify them as the companies that are in the supply chain of large companies or smaller companies that already export to the EU or the clients demand them to do some kind of human rights due diligence or to have some respect of human rights in their code of conduct. So these companies now, this is regardless of size. So they feel that actually they are going to be more ready. It's not hard for them to get more ready because they say they have to comply with the client's requirements anyway. So as long as those requirements are clear, but they also expect more assistance from the larger companies in the supply chain as well. So I would say this is kind of the second bucket of companies. And so lastly, we come to the really small and medium-sized sector in Thailand who are not, kind of part of the supply chain or face any human rights related requirements from the clients. And I think these are companies that are really, I would say they are quite concerned. So first of all, I would say in terms of the understanding, a lot of companies would feel that human rights to them is like legal compliance. It's kind of, okay, we just new law, does it mean new laws and we have to comply with that. And then many of them see the HRDD, the due diligence, as a first thing they say is a cost, is a burden to them, right? Because SME, they say they have to struggle already with the day-to-day business, and coming out of COVID, I mean, it's already very difficult. So they would expect that We would say quite a lot of them are also concerned about, potential, this, I think, as you mentioned, potential trade barrier or kind of protectionism. So I think that's where they are. And so the more, I guess, the way of enforcing, let's say if HIDD is going to be mandatory, the difference between enforcing it as like strict enforcement and a kind of having some sort of grace period or pathways or assistance or capacity building, that's going to make a difference, I think, in terms of the SME's capacity to comply, I would say.
Who do you a couple of interesting things there, and thank you for giving me an answer in 3 parts. Large, there's a response from large companies, there's a response from small companies, and there's an approach from, or response from companies that are both large and small, but are used to exporting to the EU and many of its compliance measures. One of the interesting things you brought up was the question of how much human rights due diligence is enough. I don't know if we have the answer here today for that, but who's in the best place to tell these companies how much is enough? Are companies themselves really well positioned to say that? Or is that a directive that needs to come from the ministerial level or regulatory level here in Thailand?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the company's perspective, they really would, they say they would prefer much more detailed guidance from the regulators, as well as also the other agencies that are involved. Also, they feel that if it's possible to have some sort of international mechanism. For example, a few companies we talked to, the large ones, they say that some of their clients, for example, in the EU, not only mandate, right? So stricter human rights requirement that they also had, but they also have program, to assist them as a supplier to better comply. So they say those measures are very useful and is really appreciated. And so they think that should be done more, and more systematically, and also between them and their suppliers, like smaller suppliers in the supply chain, if that could be designed as a kind of this sort of pathway for compliance. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about another pathway of compliance. I'd like to turn the conversation now to Lena, if I may. Lena, there's a lot of business membership-driven organizations focused on sustainability that have their own approaches, that provide guidance, that in fact audit companies in their membership pool according to certain standards to ensure human rights and environmental risks are mitigated. Now, I understand that your organization, RSPO, is currently undergoing a review of your 2018 principles and criteria, this P&C criteria. I understand that the P&C are used by auditors to ensure members are complying with human rights standards. That's essentially how RSPO certifies sustainability. Correct me, of course, if I am wrong, but tell us a little bit about this process of review, and importantly, what are some of the gaps that you're finding in the 2018 P&C that you intend to fill?
Thank you very much, Sean, and good morning to everyone and to those online. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the organizers for inviting the RSPO to this event. And yes, short. RSPO's speciality is that they are able to bring players along the palm oil supply chain. And we are talking about processors, producers, consumer good manufacturers, retailers, social NGOs, bank and investors, and also environmental NGOs. And our standards are revised every 5 years to ensure that our certification requirements continue to remain relevant in meeting progressing standards, and be it in the perspective of good governance or environmental and social protection. And like you said, yes, we are currently in our second public consultation for the review of our principles and criteria. It's on our website. We invite anyone to make comments to the document. And what we have is that our standards are then, once it's been issued, auditors will, third-party auditors will conduct audits on our members to check on their compliance. They will be, if there are issues, they will be given the opportunity to address those shortcomings. And if they don't, then, well, they will not be issued a certification. And as we all know, if you're not issued a certification, you lose your market access. So, and with regards to the gaps that we've identified, now, one of the things that happened was that when one of our members was issued with a WRO, we actually did a...
Which is a, can you explain?
It's a withholding release order, where our goods, well, the members' goods were not allowed to enter into the particular country, and what that propelled us to do was to actually do a gap analysis between our standards and the ILO requirements. And we did come across these gaps, and what we have is like such as we found that there was a lack of definition of what related cause is. We did not have a specific indicator on isolation because palm oil by itself is usually in isolated areas. And also, given the prevalence of the issue of debt bondage, because a lot of our members employ migrant workers, we have now tried to add into our current new standards the importance of having an annual human rights due diligence assessment of third-party recruitment process for migrant workers. Now, we all know that governments are the best poised to address this more efficiently. However, RSPO has to take the initiative and to move from commitment to action and thereby making it as part of our standards to undertake this due diligence.
Can you just speak a little bit more about that, the principles and criteria? To what extent does it align with the steps involved with human rights due diligence, or doesn't in fact? Or should we understand it differently?
To be honest, Sean, it actually does. Because, for example, if a palm oil producer wants to open into a new land, they will have to do the assessment and identify what are the potential risks there are, such as they need to do a high conservation value assessment, a high carbon stock assessment, social and environmental impact assessment, including they are required to undergo a free and informed prior consent to assure that communities and indigenous groups have actually given their consent to their land. Now, if problems are found during these assessments, they are required to address these, to mitigate or ameliorate or address these issues, including they need to provide a grievance or establish a grievance mechanism. Then, in terms of tracking those effectiveness of those actions, as we have mentioned earlier, they are audited every 5 years, then are subjected to an annual audit, surveillance audit. And importantly, communication. Under our standards, our members have to provide adequate information regarding the legal, environmental, and social issues under our standards in appropriate languages to our communities, indigenous peoples, and workers to allow for the effective participation in decision-making. Now, these types of engagement are, for us, crucial because to address some of the power imbalance that we spoke of yesterday. And also, importantly, all our members have to submit their annual communication of progress, which are mandatory reports submitted by RSPO members to gauge their progress towards the RSPO certified palm oil. This reporting, this ACOP reporting, allows the RSPO to assess the members' individual progress publicly and also to identify and to respond to issues and trends that are emerging through data analysis.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. And indeed, the question of assurance, I think, and reporting communications will be an area of intense focus going forward under this mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence heading. One last question. I had a favor of someone I met in Malaysia recently. I asked, what would you ask Lena if you're up here on stage instead of me? And he said, and this is a fan of RSPO, by the way. But he did ask, please have them explain, please have Lena explain, why palm oil companies that are certified by well-respected sustainability organizations, maybe like RSPO, are being penalized by the United States and their forced labor bans. How can governments ban palm oil products even though we've conducted human rights due diligence and/or followed guidelines provided by these sustainability organizations? And if you would just keep your answer very brief so I can move to the next speaker, please.
Thanks, Sean. Basically, we've heard it here, right? The previous speaker has spoken about that we have wonderful principles, but now we need to translate them into bite-sized, precise, replicable indicators and questions. The challenge that we have is that we need that bite-sized indicators so that we can get a consistent data set no matter where you ask that question. It is this specifics that the auditors will need to make their assessments. And if we don't translate all these wonderful principles in the UNGPs into these bite size and be consistent in that, you will find you may have done your HRDD, you may have got your certification, and still fall through the cracks because someone might go in and says, well, I'm going in, if I see a problem, I'm going to penalize you. And it happens. And this is, I think, what we were speaking about earlier as well, that we need bite size. We need to know what it is on the ground rather than these wonderful principles. Brilliant. Now, let's move it to the ground.
Okay, drilling down is one of the themes I heard just now, and of course, language is also perhaps one of your messages to the bite-sized indicators and consistency in responses. Taking that theme forward, the issue of consistency, issue of language, and what have you. There is this EU approach, but of course, the Japanese government is while fully aligned with and fully supportive of the uptake of the UN Guiding Principles, is taking a slightly different approach, perhaps. But before I get into the controversies of human rights due diligence, I just want to acknowledge that Japan has come in very robustly on the business and human rights agenda. It was the second country in Asia to develop a national action plan on business and human rights following Thailand. Hideaki, tell us a little bit about why Japan is coming on board now, and how do we understand its commitment? And is this commitment really supported by large enterprises in Japan?
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Roy Metzen. I'm a practicing lawyer in Japan, and I'm also a member of the Business and Human Rights Lawyers Network in Japan, and I have been working for the last 8-9 years for enhancing or facilitating the human rights due diligence or business and human rights field initiatives to Japan. And from my perspective, that was a big step for Japan, that we had guidelines last year. And also we have reference materials published by the Ministry of Economy in April this year as well. I think short answer for Sean's question is actually overall, I believe it's well received, well supported, and well functioning, at least so far. Of course, we have some discussion or controversial discussion points, or whether we need to go to the mandatory laws. I think that we will discuss later on, but I think that's basically working well. But I'd like to quickly, summarize, what was the purpose for why the Japan, implemented the guidelines rather than law first, and how it's making impact into the Japanese communities. So I think for the purpose, in terms of the purposes, I think the key words is actually a good entry point, and also the localization, I believe. So as Sean mentions, we had a national action plan back in 2020, but I think we are very behind compared to the European countries or US, and we are trying to catch up. But if we do everything all in the sudden, I think it's probably we will have in a panic, create a lot of panic. So I think guideline is a good entry point, and guidelines are usually common approaches for the Japanese, policies. If, for example, we have a lot of M&A guidelines or corporate governance guidelines, which is a soft law, but it's working very well in Japan. So I think it's quite commonly, I think, accepted by the Japanese, companies. And also the important point is localization. So basically, guidelines are in line with the UN guiding principle, but I think we are using Japanese languages, and Japan is only the country to use Japanese languages. So I think we need to have those guidelines in Japanese, under the Japanese concept, Japanese practices, and the Japanese Companies Act. And that's actually caused a very good effect, and that's working very well. So I'd like to also touch upon the impacts that created for the Japanese communities, and as Sarini did, actually, I would separate probably for the impact for the large companies and the impact for the middle or small size company. And for the large companies, I think the key concept is actually probably commitment to action, actually. So large companies already had some human rights policies or commitments, but having these guidelines, it's a good opportunity for them to review their the current practices, and then now they are moving to the action stage. So they revise the human rights policy, and they try to have very substantive, very effective human rights due diligence or grievance mechanism. So that's the impact for the large companies. And for small companies, middle-sized companies, it's still on the commitment probably phase, but that creates a lot of kind of motivations for the small-sized companies to come up with the commitment. So, for example, I recently was asked by the small local logistic companies, truck companies, and they have a lot of truck drivers, and they have only 150 or 200 employees. And they asked me to have the human rights training program for their board of directors, because they want to implement the human rights policy. For the last 7 years, I have never experienced for that request from that size or that local companies, and they always came with the Japanese guidelines on their hands. So I think that they are referring for those guidelines. So I think that's creating very good impact for the local or mid-sized companies as well.
That's a fascinating anecdote there. I want to know if I could go back to the theme I introduced earlier about cultural differences with you, Roy. You said that the guidelines are a good way for Japan to start with guidelines. I'm wondering why. What do you mean by that? Why are guidelines good for Japan? And why isn't Japan pursuing mandatory human rights due diligence now? Will it ever be necessary, or is there ever going to be legislation mandating companies in Japan conduct human rights due diligence? What do you think?
I think yes, of course. Mandatory law has been always a discussion point for Japan to implement, and we are still discussing it, and we may have it or we may not have it. We are not yet sure, to be honest. This is under the discussion point, but I think gradually, anyway, we are kind of going to those phases going forward, and I think I'd like to probably introduce three. I think probably Japanese community prefers the step by step, rather than suddenly having the very strong mandatory requirement. So I think we don't have the mandatory laws, comprehensive mandatory laws, but I think we have gradual steps already this year as well. I'd like to quickly touch upon three, additional steps that we had. One is the public procurement. So the Japanese government just announced, I think in April, that going forward, companies bidding to participate in the public procurement is required to respect the human rights, in line with the human rights due diligence guideline that the Japanese government issued. Still, it's on a best effort basis, but I think it's creating a lot of impact for the the companies bidding into the public procurement. That's a sort of a little bit mandatory rather than soft law. The second one is actually disclosure. So although we don't have the human rights, due diligence disclosure like Modern Slavery Act, but starting from actually this month, large companies like basically listed companies needs to have the disclosure of sustainability activities, in their annual report, mandatory annual report, financial report. So that's sustainability, of course, not only covers human rights but also environment, and a lot of companies are still focusing on environment side. But I think that also creates some sort of hard law type of regulations for the disclosure. And lastly, export control. So Japanese government just announced March this year that there will be a member, there will be, that is endorsing, Japan is endorsing the export control and human rights initiative that the US announced. And so with that, I think Japanese government are probably to consider whether we would like to implement some export control, especially for surveillance technologies or facial recognition technology that Japanese companies have quite advanced techniques, technologies. So I think those gradual steps are now we are seeing, and we may go into the next phase, but that's still under the discussion. So I don't know when it comes or how first it comes, but we are kind of stepping forward gradually.
In fact, it doesn't seem gradual to me. It actually seems at a pretty quick pace, even if mandatory human rights due diligence is not scheduled at a quick pace. The reference to public procurement guidelines and mandated reporting on sustainability for listed companies, and then export controls. And I'm glad you brought that up. I mentioned it too, but I didn't link it necessarily to national security. How interesting is that due diligence, again, something as benign sounding as due diligence is being implicated in conversations about national security in the Asian region, but beyond as well. I was, again, referencing this meeting I was at in Malaysia. The EU ambassador to Malaysia was addressing a group there that was seized of this subject, and the ambassador said, "Look, I want to tell everybody here assembled that the CSDD is not going to be a magic silver bullet. It's not going to fix all problems. It's not going to fix all human rights problems, perhaps national security issue problems. There's going to be some pushback and some need to adjust for purposes of contextualization." And so he said, we're going to need accompanying measures as well as CSDD. And accompanying measures can mean different things to different people. I'd like to think it also involves engagement with trade unions. I'd like to think that it also means engagement with workers. So I'd like to turn the conversation now, Roy, over to Viesna, who is as I mentioned, a trade specialist in Cambodia. Viesna, what is your view on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence as a trade unionist in your country?
Yes, yes. Thanks, Sian. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I've been working in Cambodia to support trade union in the country who have come through different development of the economic and political situation. There, first of all, overall, the trade union group have welcomed the development, really the move from a voluntary to mandatory due diligence legislation. This move is seen positively as a big step to provide, more trade union ability to get suppliers and brands to meaningfully improve labor rights situation. And of course, at the same time, it creates a lot of expectation from the trade union in the country for the HRDD law to deliver, to address increasing challenges that they have encountered on the ground. It really, we're talking about the civic space, the more difficult operating environment, the working condition, the rise, the fact that there's a lack of transparency down in the low tier of the global the supply chain, which are declining overall. So this is probably a very good kind of global supply chain tool which can be utilized to counter this negative trend. But at the same time, there are some skepticisms about the involvement and participation of the trade union worker and trade unions in the process. So it is important that the trade union is involved, so that we can avoid the issue that effort to comply with the new HRDD compliance, it becoming ineffective, corporate-led box ticking exercise that we have encountered in, let's say, social auditing, for example. And that is also important that the responsibility and the cost that it involves is not pushed to the supply chain, which means eventually workers and the trade unions, would be the one who are paying the cost in the end because of the power imbalances we talk about that we have encountered in the supply chain.
Thank you, Viesna. I mean, I really want to explore a little bit further than this need to avoid box ticking as a means of replacing meaningful human rights due diligence. And in fact, I heard a reference just yesterday, the first time I heard it, human rights due diligence washing. We're used to greenwashing, blue washing, even transition washing was another theme I heard, but then HRDD washing. There is that threat that companies conduct this. They communicate that they've done everything really well, everyone's been consulted, and that's enough of that. See you next year. Tell me how exactly might workers be involved directly in the process, the 4 or 5 step process of human rights and environmental due diligence? What would be your role today if a company approached you about its supply chain risks? What would your role look like?
Yes, I think it is important. I mean, in the HRDD processes, I mean, it's important that all stages it involve the trade unions, and that's really about a kind of risk assessment, risk mitigation, the monitoring of the result of the compliance, and then the reporting as well, and include, I think, the probably if it runs further, it's going to be access to remedy as well. So I think the argument is that since this is probably the most affected communities that the workers and the trade union represent, it is important that they are consulted, and not just consulted, but also they have a roles in, let's say, at the governance, at the discussions about the progress as well. So that is a wide range of role, and the workers and the trade union are really, I would argue, is an expert on the ground. So the objective of this legislation is really to create change on the ground. So, who would be in the right position to say, whether or not the change that intended is materialized on the ground? It would be the worker who eventually that. So I think that's important to include them at all the stages. And then at the same time, I also want to have you talk about the accompanying measures. I think it's legislations alone, it probably insufficient to address a big challenges we encountered at the. It is also important to have some sort of industry initiative, like a kind of improvement of the structural improvement, like industrial relation, for example, probably through support to the improvement of freedom of association, which I think countries across Asia have encountered, which is like a more difficult environment. Let's say just a union representation, we have a problem of who would be in a genuine representation of workers on the ground. So that's kind of accompanying measures to me, that coming up with the legislation, there needs to be a support process, support to improve industrial relations in the country, improve, let's say, collective bargaining, is improve, for example, the practical engagement of the global company in the north into the global south. I would say through using of the purchasing practices, for example, when company place order to the supplier, then it have to come up with like ring fencing labor force, labor cost, for example, which is probably a big things to prove, for example. So that's I think the previous speaker have already mentioned. A lot of practicality, details that need to be clarified in order to actualize, materialize the whole concept of HRDD on the ground. Thank you.
So because we're on the beginning of this journey here in Asia with human rights due diligence, it does make sense, at least to me, that more clarity is going to be necessary. And indeed, some of these accompanying measures, it's definitely not going to be a silver bullet. One of the accompanying measures that I picked up on, Viesna, is accompanying legislation, supportive legislation also has to come down or align with human rights due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence. legislation or guidelines that might be issued at the national level. Other things that you said were that unions and or workers' perspectives need to be involved at every stage of human rights due diligence. And you didn't say it, but it also sounded a little bit to me like you're saying workers can be a part of the assurance process, which for me is going to be a subject I'd like to bring up in future forums. The third-party assurance and quality and the extent on communication and reporting, qualifying those statements being made by companies and holding directors who sign off on those reports responsible for their contents. That's really where I think the magic will start to happen and we see real results. But who cares what I think? Let's hear, let's hear from our audience today. Let's take some questions starting from this side and moving to the right, or at least my right. And I see a question right here from the lady here, a question in the back, moving to the right. And then, ma'am, you there in the middle section. Yes, you. We'll take 1, 2, 3 just like that, and we'll try to do another round as well. Please identify yourself, and then if you can, make your question very short, and identify a speaker you'd like to respond if it's just one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Kish Perella. I'm from Washington and Lee University in the United States. So I had a question about indicators and converting the UNGPs into indicators. And my question, primarily for the representative from RSPO, is whether you believe indicators can be created on a more generalized level or whether it should be sector specific. Can there be indicators that are more universal versus particularized? And if so, what would be the appropriate body to develop those indicators?
Thank you. The next question, I forget the order that I put it to. Oh, yes, the gentleman in the back there.
Okay. My name is Andi. I from Indonesia. So maybe Lina or Sarini can answer my question. So one of the EUDR mandates are benchmarking systems. And I believe it will have a connection with the CSDDD and will coming out later, yeah. And based on our experience in Indonesia and Malaysia, refers to EUDR, our government still reviews and try to submit objection to the Parliament, Commission, and Council of EU. So I mean, what do you suggest to role for CSOs, NGOs to give the push to our government to maximize the EUDR and also the human rights due diligence in the future? Thanks.
Yeah, very well put question. Ma'am.
Well, hello, this is Sarah Fung, and I'm a policy advisor and researcher on business and human rights, and today here on behalf of the Center for Human Rights and Sports in Germany. And before that, I was working with the German Institute for Human Rights. During that time, I was conducting a quite comprehensive study on the human rights responsibility of palm oil purchasing companies in Germany. And during that study, we found out that most companies do rely on certification schemes like RSPO to comply with human rights due diligence. But as our study found that it's not enough. It is a quite powerful tool to support companies in fulfilling the requirements, but it's not yet what the UNGP says, and I also don't think that's their, that's the way that RSPO intends to go, but maybe more of a support to achieve sustainability. So my question, I actually have quite a couple of questions. So I'd be interested, for example, as Ms. Ghosh mentioned, the grievance mechanism, how this actually looks like, and if there are like criteria in place to ensure its effectiveness in terms of affected rights holders claiming their rights. So is it accessible, or something like that? Maybe you can mention something about the criteria if they're in place. And to the other panelists, perhaps, as we found that most German companies do rely on certification schemes, I'd be interested to hear your opinion. Can that be enough? Is that a measure that your companies also regard as the main tool, or what is their comprehension? Do they think they can comply with that? Is that like enough to comply, or what kind of other measures do your companies take? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We had 3 questions, 2 of which I think were directed to Lena, but she's used to that. But I'd like to open the panel up to answer any of those questions. But let's start perhaps with Lena and that first question about indicators.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your question. What we have found doing this current standards revision is that the feedback was that our indicators were very good, but may not be very implementable and auditable. And when you speak to the auditors, although the auditors say, you need to be precise. What is it that we want to look for? And so your question, if it came down to the auditors, who are ultimately the ones who are going to be looking at those indicators, it needs to be precise. What are you looking for? How do you make that assessments? So in a short answer, it's better to be precise rather than general. When you use general, they won't know what to look for. Sorry. Then there was a question about, from back there, regarding the benchmarking and about the EUDR. I think RSPO is also part of that engagement. And I actually wanted to say, Sean, that it is forums like this that should actually provide the opportunity for engagement between the governments from the north right down to the south, to discuss how human rights should be, ought to be protected through enhanced understanding of the complexities of the specific industries as well as their supply chain. As mentioned earlier about smallholders, we have 7 million smallholders that's involved in the palm oil. Out of it is about 3.3 million, I think, in Malaysia and Indonesia. And in Thailand, there's about 364,000 smallholders. They too are part of this discussion. They ought to be at the table. And I think that ideally these forums and these discussions should actually take place before legislation comes out, rather than we running after them and trying to now amend what we have. We ought to be there right from the start. And then the third question from the lady there. I think Sarah mentioned about audit fatigue. I think also RSPO as a sustainability organization, we're also trying to look at how do we not just rely on audit or certification. We want to move towards sustainability. And what this possibly means is looking at really risk assessments. Can we say when we go to a particular plantation, for example, can we look at a situation and say, okay, there is a potential of a labor abuse, and something needs to be done about that. So we're kind of undergoing this transformative shift about looking not just at certification and auditing, but really looking at a risk assessment approach to our standards and assuring that having to balance both sustainable development goals as well as human rights protection. As you mentioned, because there is going to be leakages. People are going to find markets elsewhere. If a particular country is particularly fussy about their due diligence, then okay, we'll find somewhere else. So we need to avoid that. And what I would like us to do is that I'd like Asia to take lead in this mandatory human rights due diligence, like what Japan has done. In relation to grievance mechanisms, we have two sets. It's mandatory for our members to have establish their grievance mechanisms. It has to confirm anonymity. The procedures need to be informed to the workers or the communities, be it for land issues. And also failing that, we also have what they call the complaints and appeals procedure, which anyone can just submit an email to say there is a complaint about, well, either a company is not addressing grievance mechanisms. And then can I just also one last thing, right? Grievance mechanisms, right? we have members who have 4 to 5 different types of grievance mechanisms. So I was very happy that in this discussion in the last couple of days, I think we've heard from Japan the different types of mechanisms to address grievance mechanism. I don't think we have found one perfect example of a grievance mechanism, and we need to keep working, and we look at innovation on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Like I said, she's used to getting the hard questions. She's used to getting a lot of questions. But with that in mind, to be fair to Lena, let's take the next set of questions that would be directed not at palm oil and not at Lena. All right, to diversify. Okay, so this is not about palm oil, correct, ma'am? Yes. So you're number 1, number 2, and then I gotta spread it around here. Non-UN people first get priority. I saw you ask a question in my last session. Right here down the middle. That will be the next 3. I'll try to accommodate everybody, but let's start here. Oh, yeah, good. Thank you for finding the microphone.
Thank you so much, and I think it's very important, strategically important discussion, and I want to say thank you. But I won't focus your attention and draw attention deeply for mining company Kumtor, which work in several countries, not only in Kyrgyzstan. I represent Forum Asia. I am member Forum Asia, which in Bangkok, and I am elected executive committee in this Forum Asia, and represent Kyrgyz NGO One World Kyrgyzstan. And start with environment. The Kumtor mine is intimately connected to the destruction of glaciers that provide drinking water in my country. The gold deposits are under glacier that need to be removed in order for the mining operation to take place. The mine is also responsible for pollution in the rivers, including an accidental spill in '98 into the Barskon River that led to the mass poisoning of villages. Lake Petrov, located above the mine's tailings, the ponds that contain the chemical waste resulting from mining operation is at risk of overflowing and glacier around in Mil. If this happens, the lake will flood the tailings, which will in turn overflow and release the chemical waste into the country water system. And I want to focus for your attention for this report, together with Forum Asia expert we produce. And
Thank you very much
I
for
have
that.
only question, how will create a new strategy against impunity? Because several times Canada Parliament discussed about new legislation when mining company can be held legally responsible for their activity outside the country. And that's why we need to identify and focus strategic, these systematic violations from big companies. And it's a lesson from past, because if you don't learn from past, it means we don't have successful new strategy now. Thank you.
We agree with you completely, particularly on that last statement. And of course, more needs to be learned about the activities of this industry in your country. And thank you for bringing attention to it. I'm going to move to the next question quickly, and let's make sure that it is focused on a question. If you could address the speaker again. Where did I'm sorry. Right there, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. We all know about Japan, the discipline they carry in their work, and the tradition and the discipline they have and the dedication they have towards the indigenous people. But my question to the Japanese delegate, that we all know there is a company called JICA that works in many other countries. And in this session, we have found many complaints against the company. So I would like to make one short notice that JICA has been working in the east of India, where I belong to. We are all indigenous people out there. Firstly, we are not defined what is indigenous people by the government of India. Secondly, JICA have been working in healthcare, industrialization, and infrastructure development. Recently, due to the malfunctioning and carelessness of JICA, many people have lost their life. And yesterday, a girl from a school. She's just a 17-year-old girl. Due to the carelessness of JICA, have lost her life in the road accident. And last week itself, same incident for the carelessness of JICA, many families have lost their lives and the dear ones. And what can we do for such a careless?
We'll open the panel up for responses. Do I have any takers?
Yes, thank you very much for your question, and thank you very much for the important points that we should be aware of. And yes, we actually in Japan we have known, not only in India that you just described, but also for other jurisdictions. I think JICA or especially other relevant companies with respect to the JICA project or other project project in South Asian countries have some issues and claims that we are receiving, and some of them actually went to the NCP, National Contact Point, but NCP does not have any strict resolution mechanism in Japan at this moment. So I think we are still kind of in the phase of struggling to solve those kind of issues in an effective way. But at least I can say that as we just described here, or as Alina quickly mentioned, that we are trying to come up with some grievance mechanism in the Japanese community, so that we could have effective grievance and for the Japanese companies as well. So hopefully, in the near future, we could listen to very carefully what you just described, and we could solve those kind of issues effectively. Yeah, but that's probably what I can say at this moment. But we are trying our best to improve as an entire community of Japan.
Thank you, Roy. I think I'll move to the next few set of questions then. A gentleman right here in front, a gentleman in the back, and a gentleman here.
My name is J.C. Kim. I'm working for public interest lawyers organization based in Korea. My question is going to Mr. Roy, and I'm very impressed with the advancement in Japan. And in Korea, we have similar kind of soft law of human right due diligence, but it is only should apply only to a state-owned enterprise. 2 years ago, I conducted kind of comprehensive research on how they implement this soft law. But one of my findings is that, while the small scale enterprise, they spend a lot of time to implement this soft law guideline, even though they have very low risk of human rights. But large company, large state-owned company, like including energy company with very high risk of human rights, they totally disrespect the guideline. So my question is, how do you evaluate? You said guideline is working well, but how do you evaluate the effectiveness of the guideline? And can you introduce some cases where, due to this existence of guideline, they started identifying potential and actual impact and addressed according to the guideline?
Thank you. Let's hear that next question. Next two questions, and I think that'll have to be it. Is that right? I can't remember now who I identified. I definitely know I pointed you out in the blue shirt.
Thank you. My name is Florian Reynaud. I'm from the country director of Heinrich Böll Foundation Myanmar office. And my question goes to Ms. Monti, because you mentioned in the beginning that you were approached already on mappings also to help from companies in Cambodia to help you map the supply chain. And I'm wondering in how far you as Eurocham are trying to involve also CSOs and NGOs, because they are often at the very heart of the work and have been mapping and documenting, collecting data of issues in supply chains on human rights, because my fear would be if this is neglected or not taken care of, that civil society, just as well as labor unions, also need to be involved in this process. It becomes a very bureaucratic, legalized business exercise again, and I do see a potential there to bring together also businesses with civil society organizations, and also prevent maybe this antagonist state that we are very much in. We talked about slap in the morning, so I do see huge potential there to really have people at the same table and bring more of a common interest together. So I'm wondering, are there any attempts already by Eurocham, either on the Cambodian example or also elsewhere on that, to bring businesses and NGOs together in that sense? Thank you.
And the last question, right here, sir.
It's not a question, but I'm working at the PwC right now, but before that, I worked at JICA. So I would like to respond to the question from the lady. And JICA has a guideline for environmental and social considerations, and also they have objection procedures. So you can contact that procedure if you have such grievance. Okay.
Thank you very much. So we're going to answer those questions. If there's time, we'll take one more, but otherwise, that'll wrap up our session today. I think the first one was to you again, Roy.
So thank you very much for the question about our progress. So I think of course the guidelines are still soft law, so I think it's not a perfect solution, and the legally speaking, it can be ignored, of course. So I think not 100% of the companies are respecting guidelines, but I think it's having a very good impact, as I mentioned, to the large companies as well as the small companies. And I think the point is actually they set the local standards, in Japan, in the local ways, in the local languages, in the local approaches. I think that's probably the way that. The reason why it's working well. Of course, it's basically in line with the UN guiding principle. Of course, there are some discussions whether this is really in line with the UN guiding principle, but basically overall it's in line with. And of course, UN guiding principle has been for the last more than 10 years, but that itself did not, spread out into the Japanese community. But once it localized into the guidelines, I think it has a lot of, impacts. For I think that kind of localization. The key, for this effective, the function, and also recently, I think large companies are also very careful about their ESG, requirement by the institutional investors or analysts or other, kind of social, request. And for example, I also have received increase recently more from the analysts of the market or the institutional investors, and how this guideline should be implemented in a Japanese listed company. And for the Japanese listed company, although it's not a mandatory requirement itself, I think probably from the viewpoints of the fiduciary duty of the directors of the large company, listed companies, I think, if it could be a fiduciary duty issue, because, 90% of the companies in the same industry has the human rights due diligence. And then you are the company which does not have a human rights due diligence program and have some issues going forward. I think that may create the fiduciary duties under the Japanese Companies Act concept as well. So I think that kind of indirect pressure, but I think still setting a standard in Japan under the Japanese Companies Act concept, I think that was probably creating kind of indirect pressure for the large companies to respect soft laws.
Interesting. Sarah, sir, I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry, sir. Sarah?
Yes, thank you for the questions. Also, because I mean, the majority of our strategies are based on stakeholders' consultations that we do on a regular basis. Actually, I mean, so we cannot do, I mean, our job without local stakeholders' support, without international organizations, without local NGOs, which have, I mean, the real numbers and which know, I mean, the context also beyond the business ecosystem. Because, I mean, as the European Chamber of Commerce, of course, so we start from the business point of view, but we need also to look for a collective effort. And that's why, for example, on a regular basis, we want to organize sort of public-private dialogue event where we involve and invite to participate offices, I mean, from authorities from the government and also local NGOs and civil societies representatives, which have, I mean, specific expertise on specific topics that we want to address from an event to another. So, I mean, collective efforts and continuous consultations of all local stakeholders are a key driver of the Responsible Business Hub strategy.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm going to turn to Serenine now and ask her to either respond to any one of the questions and or just provide her concluding thoughts.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to circle back to the earlier question about the role of CSOs in the HRDD and similar engagements. I think that there are two things that are really helpful because HRDD is a process, right? It's an ongoing process. And we should not lose sight that all we want is really better outcomes, right? So it doesn't really matter if you have a lot of, checklists, so to speak, if the outcomes get worse, or really the same. So I would say that the first thing, and this is also taking the cue from the discussions that we had as part of our research with, human rights defenders in Thailand. So first is to engage more on the HRDD language. So for instance, in Thailand, people have said, well, maybe we can just come up with what the best practice grievance mechanism would look like, for a Thai company. What a best practice, meaningful engagement with communities and ethnic groups would look like prior to project development. So to give more clarity and more specific, I would say, guidance to the approach that business is about to take, because I think one challenge for the businesses is when they see HRDD is like a lot of different things across many different issues. So I think that, so first is to assist on more specific, like issue specific, especially in terms of what best practice really should look like. I think the second thing goes back to your earlier point about human rights washing or HRDD washing, which I think that this is a big risk and we're maybe starting to see some of that in Thailand as well. So definitely CSOs as people who really work directly with the stakeholders and they're on the ground. I think you have a lot to bring to the table, about the instances that you would just identify as, this is human rights washing, or also the quality, assessing the quality of the human rights reports or indicators announced by companies. I think that this is something that would be really useful. So it may not be much different from the work that many CSOs are already doing, right? But just kind of putting it more in the language of the HRDD and the reports that companies start to produce, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Serenine. And Viesnat, I didn't warn you about this, but maybe you have some concluding remarks yourself. And feel free to respond to any of the questions or issues raised.
Yeah, I mean, the points, I think it also come out from our conversation today, is that the role of the local government into this HRDD process. I think, I mean, the concept came out of the fact that, probably more relevant in Asia, where local labor governance is substandard, if I would say. And this is an effort to use global supply chain strategies, as a way to innovate, to circumvent the challenges that we have encountered at the national level. So the effort to really make it, like strategic theories and, like engage with the local jurisdiction, it probably complicates the process. So, to me, probably the perspective that, like make it like global supply chain strategy, make it very much involved with the company in the producing the sourcing country, and then of course engage with the private sector, engage with the worker in the global supply chain, and of course make an effort to get the state country to facilitate the process rather than like making use of making it as an opportunity to use the national local standard to to interact with this instrument, I would say.
Interesting conceptual and still very practical suggestions on the way forward. We are over 12:30, the time limit now, by a couple of minutes, so I'm going to have to close it to questions and bring this session to a close. Just as a quick summary, some big themes came out. Readiness, of course, was a theme. That was one of the points of our session today. The readiness of companies in Cambodia and Thailand and Japan, but also concerns too that not all stakeholders would be involved or being involved at this point. And so, our labor unions, are the perspectives of other stakeholders going to be included in this human rights due diligence process? What does readiness actually mean? Companies need to be ready, in fact, to involve workers in greater measure. Another theme was clarity. Greater clarity is needed for next steps. We need to ensure that that clarity comes from regulators, but also from indicators. But in tension with that, or in contrast to that, we need to avoid bureaucratic solutions and box-ticking exercises. We need to avoid the threat of human rights due diligence washing. Another theme, size matters. In terms of the effectiveness of incentives, big companies are ready for this. They have been ready. They've seen it coming down the line for some time. SMEs have fewer resources and fewer incentives. We'll need to start working more closely on that. And lastly, I like how Serenice ended her reflections with a focus on better outcomes. That's why this is why we're engaging in human rights due diligence. That's why some of us very much support CS-DDD and other mandatory measures. Ultimately, we're looking for better outcomes, and that's going to involve a multi-stakeholder approach to mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. Now, a couple themes that we did not talk about today. Notably, we did not bring in the environment on human rights and environmental due diligence. And that's a blind spot, rather, that we're going to shine a light on at our October 4 and 5 forum. We're going to focus much more on the environment. And indeed, we'll talk about human rights due diligence there. And also the gendered view on human rights due diligence. To the extent that there is a perspective there, I'd like to see more unpacked under that heading. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here today, taking forward the messages you might have heard today, and congratulating with me our panelists on a fantastic session. Thank you so much. Over to you, Harpreet.
Thank you, Sean. I don't know, is it working? Working. Can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, good. Yeah, indeed, Sean, thanks. I think it's an excellent session, and thank you for that summary. I was just going to say that, we kind of established that, of course, MHRDD is not a silver bullet, but it has definitely built a positive momentum towards stronger accountability. You covered many of the points that I was going to summarize, but I hope it is just not another washing opportunity or phenomena. So thank you very much for this excellent panel. I think just a couple of announcements here. We do have 3 side sessions right now during the lunch break. So the lunch break is 12:30 to 2 o'clock. The side session, mainstreaming human rights-based approaches at all level of fisheries management to end illegal fishing and forced labor at sea. Southeast Asia region is focus, is in the meeting room MRH. There's a session on indigenous sovereignty and just transitions in meeting room A, and there's a session actually on making human rights due diligence work for home workers, which I think is a really good continuation for a session from here in meeting room F. We will come back to the plenary upstairs in CR1, where the last plenary of the forum would be held just before the closing plenary, focusing on the disability rights in the business and human rights agenda. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy your lunch.
Recording stopped.